Tisztelt Hölgyeim és Uraim! Az erdélyi MCC nevében engedjék meg, hogy először a helyi vendégeket magyarul köszöntsem. Stimato auditoriu, bine ați venit, és ezentúl angolul folytassam a kedves meghívott professzorokra tekintettel. Honorable invited professors and researchers, dear colleagues, dear invited speakers, dear audience. On behalf of the Matthias Corvinus Collegium, I warmly welcome everyone to our event. Let me now share some short facts about the MCC in Transylvania. Matthias Corvinus Collegium offers free, useful trainings that complement school studies, unique talent management for enthusiastic young people in 9 training centers across Transylvania. MCC's activities in Transylvania bring together more than 2,000 students in 8 locations and 4 educational programs. In the last academic year, the Young Talent Program had 545 students. The high school program had 1,400 members. The university program had more than 114 students, and 19 young people studied in a Transylvanian School of Politics. The Transylvanian High School program was launched 11 years ago in 2013 in Kolozsvár and Székelyudvarhely, and the Kolozsvár University program started in 2018, so 6 years ago. The organization's Transylvanian Administrative Center is in Kolozsvár, the hometown, the native town of King Matthias. The Collegium supports all young people regardless of their financial, social and cultural background who are curious about the world, want to be educated and informed, and in the long run want to become useful members of society and their local communities among Hungarians in Transylvania and in the wider Carpathian Basin. The MCC supports young people who want to be useful in their local communities, who feel responsibility for their environment, so they can develop their talents and use them for the benefit of themselves, in the long run for the benefit of society. As scientific events, the MCC promotes the research activity of students and the dissemination of their results for the larger public too. In this sense, we are honored to host this scientific event too, addressing the lieux de mémoire, the places of memory of different cultural entities, including national linguistic communities living in Transylvania and Romania for centuries. The site of Ani, the capital of the medieval Kingdom of Armenia, is the most famous, and I dare to say it, sacred place of memory due to its millennial history. Competing with Cairo, Baghdad, and Constantinople, the city became famous for its 40 gates and 1,001 churches. Of course, this is a symbolic number, but unfortunately, the large city with more than 100,000 inhabitants was shaken by an earthquake in the 11th century. Many Armenians got refuge after this earthquake in the Kingdom of Hungary and Moldavia, nowadays Moldavia. Ani now stands in ruins, even if it is a place with UNESCO World Heritage place. It was a political, economical, and cultural developed center that symbolized Armenian statehood throughout the centuries, and both the Moldavian Armenian people from the Middle Ages or those who were expelled from there since the 16th and 17th century, or those who moved to Transylvania since the 16th century due to the Transylvanian religious tolerance, considered their ancient capital as the place of their origin, the main capital of the Bagratuni Kingdom, which received the status of capital from 941 Anno Domini. Coincidence or not, but the earliest proof of the presence of Armenians on nowadays Moldavia or nowadays Hungarian territories were inscriptions on different tombstones dated back in the 10th century, for instance, in the city of Cetatea Albă, Ackerman, on the seashore of the Black Sea, but also the Hungarian chronicles mention that during the reign of King Stephen, the first Christian king of Hungary, settled along with other nations, Polish, Greek, or others, a great number of Armenians who received privileges and noble degrees. And in the Hungarian Kingdom, or even in Transylvania, we can still find many place names, including the Armenian noun or adjective örményes, that means Armenian settlement. So I could mention another archival sources on the presence of Armenian people in Moldavia, Transylvania, or the Kingdom of Hungary. Let me just quote a document dated in 1281 by King László IV that mentions Terra Armenorum and Monasterium Armenorum, which belonged, of course, to Armenians. And let me quote two quotations from one of the biggest Romanian historians, Nicolae Iorga, that once wrote that Principality of Moldavia was created through commerce, and those who did commerce became contributors in the creation of the state in Moldavia. Therefore, Armenians are, in some way, the parents of Moldavia. And in another book, we can find a quotation from the same Nicolae Iorga. Generally, during those times, there was no Moldavian fair, therefore commerce without the Armenians. And as for the existence of Armenians in Transylvania, the sources show that in the 16th century there were already tombstones engraved with Armenian letters and in Armenian language, for instance in Csíkszentvíz, Frumosa. Later on, Prince Apafi Mihály settled them in Ebesfalva in the second half of the 17th century. And 1 century later, it received a new name, Elizabethopolis. And in this respect, we must note, as we talked at the lunch, that brand new establishment, the grassroots, green grass town was erected, founded by the establishment of Armenopolis city, Gerla Szamosújvár today. In the 18th century, the city was built near the Somes river, because the Armenians had been living in this area since the early 17th century, and having King Leopold I or the Emperor Leopold I's approval, they built that city, Armenopolis, and of course they bought the whole field of the Somes River with 25,000 florins, and they the design project of Armenopolis city was carried out by an architect called Alexanian. So, and the second city in Transylvania, and I must mention my colleague Emma Shepal, who is expert in this, is Elizabethopolis, Erzsébetváros, or Ebesfalva, where they were settled by the Transylvanian princes. So, honorable invited professors and researchers, dear colleagues, the presentations offer for the audience different representations of Ani and explore the effects of the lost city on heritage and identity in 2 sessions. In the first panel, and I was nominated as a moderator of the first panel, so excuse me for being too long probably. In the first panel, the city of 1001 temples, Ani and the Armenian cultural heritage, will explore the origin, the current geopolitical status and situation, as well as its religious tourism, or more specifically, cultic significance. Under the title Ani, the lost city in the Armenian imagination and beyond, we can listen to the analyses and thoughts of prominent international researchers on the topic. Professor Dr. Peter Cowie, professor at the University of California, expert on Armenian archival sources, manuscripts, ancient prints. He also edited an anthology of modern Armenian drama as a film and theater specialist, researcher of medieval Armenian rulers, royal ideology, and modern Armenian nationalism, first. Then Professor Dr. Elke Hartmann, professor of Ottoman studies at Free University of Berlin. Her research focus are Ottoman history in the 19th, 20th century, especially questions of modernization, military history, cultural and technical adaptation processes, minorities, nation and state formation, collective violence and its organization, genocide, memory and historiography, personal testimonials, and of course, last but not least, Ottoman-Russian connections, trans-Ottoman mobilities. And finally, in this panel, we invite to take the floor Dr. Konrad Sikierski, cultural anthropologist, postdoctoral researcher at the Free University of Berlin. And in the second panel, that is dedicated to Ani's memory in Armenian culture and diaspora, we are honored to have our guest lecturers and professors, Dr. Balint Kovács, head of the Department of Armenology at Pázmány Péter Catholic University, Dr. Karen Yalatian, researcher at the Leipzig Institute, and Dr. Vahe Tahian, head of the Haushamadian project in Berlin. Sorry for... On behalf of Matthias Corvinus Collegium, I warmly wish you all a pleasant and inspiring conversation and listening to our honorable guest professors.
Thank you very much for your introduction. I'm very pleased to be invited to participate in this symposium on Ani, the city and the multiple dimensions of its continuing significance. I'd like to divide my talk into 4 parts. A, to provide a brief modern historical account of the city's ascendance and demise. B, to review the oral history narrative of the Transylvanian Armenians Association with the medieval capital, some of which you already heard from the introducer. C, succinctly to explore the factors behind that second narrative. And finally, D, to contextualize some modern perspectives on the city's continuing importance. Contemporary Armenians feel deep affinities with the city of Ani. Ani is a capital that resonates with people much more than Tikranagerd from Tikran II's empire, or Ardashat, or Dvin, or Bagaran, Shiragavan, Kars, Sis, and the others, all of which are now emblazoned on the wall of the municipality building in Yerevan. A legend in its lifetime, hyperbole characterizes its descriptions. Medieval writers frequently referring, as we heard already, to its 1001 churches. So what briefly was that history? In the 5th and 6th century CE, Ani is recorded as a fortress of the Gamsaragan family, which then passed to the Bagratids in the early 9th century to serve as the treasury of their estates. In 961, King Ashot III transformed it into his capital, continuing expanding under his heirs until it attained its apogee under King Gagig I, 989 to 1020. Adhering to the policy of other regional dynasts, his son, Hophanes Sumbat, bequeathed the state to Byzantium, and moves were underway to enact this agreement when his son, Gagig II, organized resistance. After the latter's visit to Constantinople, a Byzantine governor was dispatched to integrate the kingdom into the Byzantine Empire. However, the Ducad dynasty in Byzantium had reduced the troops' pay in an effort to stem fiscal depletion. And so the latter afforded little resistance to Seljuk raiding incursions and the subsequent invasion with an eye to conquest. Consequently, Ani fell to Alp Arslan's Seljuk army in 1064, after which his son Malik Shah sold the city to a branch of the Kurdish dynasty of the Shaddadids of Dvin and Barda in 1072. They appear to have held it with interruptions until 1199. First independently, but from the time of the Georgian king Georgi III as tributaries. In that year, 1199, Queen Tamar of Georgia assigned the region to her Armenian Zakharid generals, Zakhare and Ivane, after which it endured successive Khwarezmian attack of 1225 to 31 and the Mongol campaign of 1236, we'll come back to this, 1236 to 44, with the Zakharids continuing thereafter under Mongol suzerainty. After the demise of the final Mongol Ilkhan, Abu Said, in 1335, rivalry between the candidates for the throne dragged on for an extra 15 years, providing instability. Yet it seems not to have severely impacted trade with Ani. Moreover, despite the impact on trade routes by Ling Timur's campaigns in the late 14th and 15th century, commerce along the important axis to Trebizond continued until that state's incorporation into the Ottoman realm in 1461. Indeed, Ani sustained its position as a provincial capital and mint successively under the Jalairids, circa 1335 to 1406, and in the initial period of Karakoyunlu rule, circa 1406 to 1468. Thereafter, the latter probably took the decision to transfer that status to Yerevan, the current capital of the Armenian Republic, which had been gaining in mercantile importance in the post-Mongol era. Hence, it is in a much diminished size that Ani passed into Ottoman administration in the 16th century, being relegated to the rank of a capital of a sanjak or provincial division in 1578, while its rival Kars, about which we'll hear much more from the next speaker, upstaged it as a center for the whole province. Probably the final blow to Ani's status as a viable community derives from the Persian Shah Abbas I's scorched-earth policy in his border conflict with the Ottomans in the early 17th century, as a result of which he depopulated large swathes of territory, relocating the inhabitants to much more central regions of his realm as a disincentive for his adversaries to invade. Various sources discuss the unprecedented scale of the operation, extending from Ani to Julfa, and its deleterious effect on the displaced population. In consequence, 17th century travelers to Ani described the spot as a ruin, though still maintaining something of its former elegance. Now, the narrative I've just summarized is based on epigraphy, building activities, coinage circulation, and a variety of sources in different genres and languages, mainly non-Armenian. From it, Ani emerges as a city with a complex history featuring much fluctuation, but one still fairly continuous, characterized by a long, gradual period of final decline. Nevertheless, for most of its extended existence, Ani functioned as an important international commercial hub and administrative center. Nor does it appear from this record that enemy attacks dealt an incapacitating blow to economic buoyancy, either by destruction, mayhem, or population dispersion, despite the immediate but limited jolting effect on various occasions. Moving now to section B. Let's compare that account with the oral history narrative of the Armenian community of the Crimea, from which, to some degree, the Transylvanian community evolved later on. After oral transmission, I think this is extremely important, oral transmission by word of mouth, during which, for several centuries, during which time it presumably underwent certain transformations, very typical of that medium. It was first recorded as a verse history of the key center of Kaffa, which is, of course, now Feodosia, and was this very important Genoese settlement in the Crimea. So in the year 1672, we see it in book form by this author, Mardiros Grimetsi, Mardiros from Crimea. There the poet recalls the history of the community's origins, which had circulated not in books, but in oral tales, thus necessitating him to assume the role of being the first historian. So in the second half of the 17th century. What is striking about his work is its emphasis on four interlocking features, to which we'll return. A, collective sin, provoking divine wrath and punishment. B, total destruction of the city and annihilation of the bulk of the population. C, the captivity of the remaining, and finally D, the latter's dispersion. This pattern recurs even more patently in another composition by the same poet in the same decade that purports to be a retelling, and this is an important point, a retelling of the biblical book of Lamentations. But actually, it underlines a series of parallels between the Jewish and Armenian experience. The key issue here is one of theodicy for an ecclesiastical audience. The sense is that in a moral universe, if you do good, you shall fare well. So any setback or failure requires the corollary of previous sin. If you are faring badly, you must have been involved somehow in bad conduct, either individually or collectively. The locus of the Armenian destruction is situated in Ani, which is completely ruined, while the survivors are depicted as fleeing far away. Yet, significantly, no precise data are recorded to link this exodus with any known historical events. Although the narrative concentrates on the Crimea, it contextualizes that community within the wider scattering of the people, citing by name the cities of Julfa and Van. At that point, the narrower history begins, focusing on the peregrinations of a group that crossed the Caspian and settled for a time in Sarai, capital of the Jochid Ulus, the northwestern sector of the Mongol Empire, controlled by the Golden Horde, before moving to Kaffa. Thereafter, this group similarly divides, one segment remaining in situ, while others resettle in Ackerman, whose significance we already heard, and in Wallachia, pointing ultimately, of course, to their settlement in Transylvania. The rest of the narrative then traces the history of the Crimean community up to the writer's lifetime in the second half of the 17th century. The account is interesting in fixing the year of the Armenians' arrival, or supposed arrival according to the oral legend, arrival in Kaffa in 1331, noting that Greeks constituted the earliest population of the peninsula, followed by Kipchaks and Franks, Venetians and Genoese, a little later, the text says, before finally the Armenians make their appearance. However, this oral account of the Armenians' advent does not cohere with the material culture and other written sources. For example, an inscription in the Armenian church of St. Sarkis in Kaffa is dated 1047, which suggests the shrine itself may have been built in the 10th century, significantly earlier than the 1330s. Moreover, this evidence synchronizes with several other data that substantiate an Armenian presence on the Crimean Peninsula that began to burgeon in the 11th century as a result of international trade. Those mercantile networks connected the Crimea with other Armenian communities around the Black Sea and in the Balkans, Kiev, Lviv, etc., including locations like Ackerman, where an Armenian presence, as was indicated, is documented already from the 10th century. Similarly, the cities of Julfa and Van are found on important overland trade routes. These factors imply that Maduros' text should be interpreted as enshrining the Kaffa community's foundation legend, one associating their origin stereotypically with the destruction-dispersion paradigm connected with Ani, ignoring the role of other factors in the settlement's gradual development over several generations of peaceful growth. Probably oral tradition is also responsible for the narrative's loose connection between Ani and Kaffa, as it does not pinpoint the precise circumstances under which the fugitives were compelled to flee. Indeed, reference to a tradition of Kaffa Armenians' genealogy from the aristocratic Pahlavuni house may signify that that sort of illustrious origin in Ani may have been more salient for the community's self-image than retaining the specifics of their ancestors' itinerary. Thus, the earlier ecclesiastical narrative of sin and loss now becomes one of gain for the lay middle class. Instead of being nomads of no fixed abode, they have an identity as Anetsi, as inhabitants of Ani. And they gain an illustrious lineage from royal and aristocratic ancestors to increase their current social capital. At the same time, I think it is important to add here that this act of memory of the Armenian Kingdom involves also partial forgetting and partial imagination and invention. In the period of Ani, the Armenian kings, we should note, were not independent. They were functionaries under the suzerainty of the Abbasid Caliph of Baghdad. So I think this is important to bear in mind when we talk about the illustrious background of that capital city. Meanwhile, the position of Sarai on trade routes to Inner Asia in the Mongol period would have attracted much traffic from Anatolia to that city, some of it through raiding by the Jochid Ulus into Ilkhanid territory that resulted in the deportation of Armenian captives from various locations that might account for this element in the narrative. Meanwhile, while it is true that Ani suffered Mongol attack for its refusal to capitulate in 1236, indications are that the recovery was not especially hard or prolonged. It still continued to serve international traffic by the route of Tiflis, a secondary route via Bagaran, and the main route to Tabriz, which after the Mongol destruction of Baghdad in 1258 became the primary regional hub under the Ilkhan Abagha, 1265 to 1282. Goods would reach it by sea from the East Indian Ocean as well as overland, continuing on to Ani either via Trebizond or en route to Erzurum, Erzincan and Sivas, and then south to the Armenian Cilician port of Ayas. Ani's thriving state in this period is well conveyed by the successive accounts of the Franciscan friar William of Rubruck, who passed through the city en route for Karakorum in 1255, and that of Rabban Bar Salma, who's going in the opposite direction, who paid a visit with his pupil Rabban Marcos some 2 decades later. It is also attested in a series of inscriptions and by the construction of a belfry for the Church of the Holy Saviour in 1271. As changes in commercial conditions often take a long time to make themselves felt, over the wider networks of exchange, it appears that Ani was able to weather some of the economic downturns of the first half of the 14th century. Let's now look briefly at the second Kaffa account of the origin of Ani, found in a colophon of a Menologion of 1690, entitled Badmuchun Anets Vots Kefei, History of the Inhabitants of Ani, the new name that the community now holds, in Kaffa, composed by the manuscript's principal scribe, David Rimetzi. The codex was written in Kaffa and subsequently transported to Nakhchivan. Similarly, it retraces the same ground covered by Mardiros, in the same order, sometimes even verbatim, to the degree of repeating his predecessor's assertion that in view of the preceding oral transmission, he is perforce the first to write down this history. He is even more exercised than his source to grandstand the community's prestigious lineage, to burnish their current merchant middle-class self-image by reference to Ani as, I quote, our noble domicile. And again, I quote, the dwelling of princes and aristocrats, unquote. Again, emphasizing the notion of gain. That social elite is then viewed as directing their circuitous journey to the Crimea and overseeing construction projects as the community became established there. One important break that David makes from his predecessor's account is to locate Ani's disaster and dispersion with the Mongol seizure of the city in 1236. According to the description given by the Armenian historian Giragos Gansagetsi. Now, what is the significance of this latter text, which was to exercise an enormous influence on the construction of Armenian history right down to the 18th century? Giragos addresses Ani's capture by the Mongols in 1236 in his coverage of the broad sweep from Armenia's Christianization up to the second half of the 13th century, his own day. His rhetorically developed portrayal of the capture is prefaced by two earlier incidents pervaded by a tone of ominous unease. The first pertains to the breaking of an oath, a major sin in medieval Armenian circumstances, and its negative consequences. The nobles of Ani had forsworn themselves to their liege lord Gagik II, ushering in Byzantine rule and a loss of autonomy. Similarly, the city populace had committed an indignity towards Dioscorus, the abbot of Sanahin, who served as Catholicos of the Armenians in the period 1237 to 38, during the imprisonment of his adversary, the other Armenian Catholicos, Bedros Gedatarts. The adverse effect of this wrongdoing was perceived as subjecting them to Seljuk domination. The main passage relating to the Mongol campaign reiterates the theme of sin and initiates discussion of punishment. Once more, despite the impregnability of the city's defenses, God orchestrates a Mongol victory to chastise the population's arrogance. I quote, as has been the case from the beginning until the present, unquote. The Mongol commander, Chormagan, had sent ambassadors to accept the city's surrender. However, the Armenian mob's reaction was to kill them, provoking the enemy to lay siege and undermine the fortifications with catapults. This leads inexorably to devastation. On storming in, the Mongols are depicted as destroying the entire city, slaughtering most of the male population, including the magnates, in scenes deliberately developed to convey a deeper rhetorical impact with appropriate reference to biblical analogues. Finally, the component of dispersion is present in the Mongols taking women and children and some of the artisans into captivity. David then continues the narrative with dispersion from the city, principally to different parts of the Black Sea and the Caspian littoral and their hinterlands. The question now arises as to the origin of this ecclesiastical fourfold pattern. 1, collective sin provoking divine wrath and punishment. 2, total destruction of the city and annihilation of the bulk of the population. 3, the captivity of those remaining. And 4, the latter's dispersion, which we observe in Giragos' account and that of a whole panoply of medieval Armenian historians whose works we don't have time, obviously, now to review. It is my contention that the source lies in the historians' religious training and their association of Ani's fate with that of Jerusalem in the 6th century BCE. Jerusalem's Babylonian exile constituted a defining moment in Jewish history, signaling the end of the monarchy of Judah, the destruction of the capital, and the territory's reconfiguration as an imperial province, the redefinition of the temple in Jewish worship, and the scattering of the people, both in forced captivity in Babylon, as well as in search of refuge in neighboring states. Moreover, the memory of this cataclysmic event was perpetuated in a nexus of texts providing A, the historical record, B, an interpretation of the cause from a religious perspective in the prophecies of Jeremiah, and C, a poetic evocation of the psychological impact of the disaster in the Book of Lamentations. Let us first consider the actual historical circumstances. The event emerged out of Judah's fraught relations with the recently established Neo-Babylonian Empire, which led to increasingly severe consequences over the next decades. A first siege of Jerusalem, 605, ended in the imposition of tribute. Refusal to maintain payments resulted in a second siege in 597, culminating in the pillage of the city and the temple, the deportation of the king, court, and the elite, and the flight of other segments of the population to Moab, Ammon, and Edom. A third siege, the final one in 582-81, finalized the city's destruction with the demolition of the ramparts, together with the royal palace, the temple, and the mansions of the magnates, the severe punishment of the king Zedekiah, and the deportation of most of the remaining inhabitants. The devastation brought international trade to a standstill, while the resettlement of most of the population in Babylon and Egypt marked the inception of what would become the later Jewish diaspora. Clearly, from a purely historical perspective, those events can be explained in the context of international politics. Support for Egypt over Babylon characterizes the policy of successive kings of Judah in this period, necessitating Nebuchadnezzar II's measured but escalating response to his vassals' non-compliance. However, it was the religious viewpoint which established itself in the longer term and ultimately attained the authority of Scripture. Thus, the prophet Jeremiah portrays the disaster as a result of divine judgment on various types of corporate sin, all of which are compounded by the lack of shame or regret. Meanwhile, Lamentations, continuing an ancient Near Eastern genre, depicts the city's devastation in terms more hyperbolic than the sober historical account. How are we to understand the implication of the Jerusalem model for Ani? On the basis of our discussion, it is possible to divide the Armenian historical record into three phases, in a trajectory of growth, destruction, and later restitution. As writers were focusing on the doings of kings and Catholicoi, the core agents of what they understood by history, and most lived in monastic environments in different geographical locations, in many cases far from the city of Ani, they displayed little interest in the city per se, or the processes governing the development of that socioeconomic unit, trade, artisanry, etc. As a result, Ani's significance mainly resided in its function as a royal capital, a source of pride in the resurgent monarchy. Thus, the construction of the second perimeter wall in 977, just 14 years after the original, is heralded as a signal achievement of royal initiative and splendor. But without a deeper appreciation of the volume of trade that generated the population growth necessitating its provision. After the acme marked by Gagig II, the historian's discourse of construction and growth transforms into one of decline, associated with a series of foreign invasions that trigger their interpretative framework of sin and punishment. Moreover, as churchmen as well as writers, they are led to exaggerate the scene painting of destruction, in part as an object lesson for future generations, what to avoid. This colors their elaboration of the events of 1045, the Byzantine attack, 1064, the Seljuks, and of course 1236, the Mongols. At the same time, dispersion in the Jerusalem model becomes the standard explanation for the medieval development of the Armenian diaspora, portraying war as the primary force behind the much more complex process of demographic change. As the historians exhibited little interest in the factors behind urban expansion, so they ignored the dynamic configuration and reconfiguration of trade networks, attracting groups to relocate and populate its constituent hubs. Granted Ani's increasing marginalization from the center of Armenian affairs in the later medieval period, contemporary historians of the traditional mode, like Tovma Medzopetsi and Arakel Tavrishetsi, ceased to record the city as a present reality, but merely transmit data culled from earlier sources. The powerful watershed constituted by the events of the 16th, 17th centuries, created by Ottoman annexation of the traditional territory of Greater Armenia, the demographic redrawing of Anatolia in the aftermath of the Jalali revolt, and the expansion of the new hemisphere-wide Armenian trade network in raw silk, with particular reference to Iran and the European powers, brought about a major transformation of Armenian reality. This in turn triggered new perspectives on Ani and its current relevance. The widespread topos of Armenians as an aggregate of aliens residing in foreign states, lacking a homeland and stable institutions, gave rise to diasporic narratives of origin. Ironically, those exploited the city's symbolic capital to convey to their current merchant and artisan communities, who are of course quintessential urbanites, as illustrious genealogy exuding privilege and prestige, still couched in the traditional pattern of destruction, dispersal. Those performed a function similar to the legendary lineages of the ancient and medieval Armenian dynasties. Meanwhile, laments on Ani re-emerge from a novel perspective. Instead of the raw emotions of contemporaries disorientated by a cataclysm, they embody the attitude of distant heirs, reflecting on what might have been, or awestruck at the impressive remains, and moved to seek their restitution. Such ruminations then generate new models for the city to regain its function as capital in re-envisaging the possibility of re-establishment of Armenian statehood. That is a topic for my colleagues to follow up on. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Howie. I invite Elke Hartmann to take the floor.
So thank you also from my side for the information. For me, it's the first time I'm coming to Romania and to Transylvania, and I'm really happy to be here. And we had a marvelous, wonderful, but very short guided city tour. And I felt, and we all felt, that we could have spent more and more, as triple as much time. So that would be a good reason to come back, hopefully soon. For today, so we heard, so thank you again. Thank you for the organizers, and thank you for all the organization and taking care for us so nicely. So this was necessary before coming to the less pleasant parts, because now I start my reflection from a perspective a little bit on the side of Ani in the city of Kars. So I guess maybe you don't have the map of today's Turkey or of the region in your mind, but Ani, today completely ruined, is at the border of today's Turkey with Armenia on the Turkish side. And as it's noted so many times, it's completely in ruins because of two features, and which is true for the whole land of Armenia, the so-called Armenian plateau, so the geography which makes up Armenia. That is two things, both were mentioned before. The first is natural disasters. it is an earthquake zone. So the earthquake is not a singular earthquake, but it is a topic that is repeated over and over again. The zone is an earthquake zone. So, and also today's Armenia is an earthquake zone. And maybe the older of you may remember the very tragic earthquake in Armenia in 1988 in December. So this kind of natural devastation is an ongoing feature. And the second feature is the geography, the geostrategic place of these Armenian highlands. It's east of Anatolia, it's the Transcaucasus, it's between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. So it is a strategic position where competing empires are constantly in warfare against each other. But of course, this kind of geography brings with it a lot of devastation, a lot of warfare, a lot of history, Armenian history being structured by catastrophe and survival. And of course, developing patterns and modes, cultural techniques of survival. And of course, another aspect of this kind of geography is being at the crossroads. So this is also, it's not only a zone of devastation and constant warfare and destruction, but it's also a contact zone, a cultural contact zone, an economic contact zone. So Armenia there is a multitude of influences, religious influences from the one side, the Byzantine, the proper Armenian, but also from the eastern part, the Persian religions. There is the influence from the south, from the Semitic countries. So there is a multitude of influences in the nearer range and also in the far range. So, and this makes up the history of the Armenians. So this was a prelude of why am I looking at Kars. Today, when you approach Armenia, Ani, the ancient capital, the medieval capital of the Armenians, it's a ruined city. And the next city that is still a living city is Kars. So Kars also from antiquity figures in the sources. Slightly different than Ani, and of course in many respects in parallel. Here also Kars figures as, and there is some etymology of the name which ascribes the name of Kars as Garuts Pert, which means a stronghold, a fortress. And that's the feature when you come and visit Kars today. The first thing that you see is the gigantic fortress. So it was a military base. It was also an Armenian capital of another Armenian kingdom. And, but also, maybe some of you came across the name of the city of Kars from the Turkish novelist Orhan Pamuk's novel, Kars. And here he takes Kars as chiffre for huge amounts of snow in winter. And that's also, you find this topic of huge amounts of snow. Of course, we are in the Armenian highlands, Armenian plateau, which is high mountainous. It's 2,000 meters, 3,000 meters. And it is this continental climate. So, of course, you have very, very strong winters and very hot summers. And yes, the snow of Kars is legendary. So that's the setting of Kars, but still, and Kars, it's not so far away from Ani, but it survived as a city. What I'm looking at Kars is, so Ani is somehow, it is still there in its medieval shape, and after that it's ruined. So we have the medieval layer, and that's it. In Kars, we have like the layers of a sediment or a palimpsest, the crossing, the coming and going, the change of cultures. So we have the antique fortress. And that remains. It becomes the fortress and the strategic point, a military stronghold for the empires to come and go, and I spare you the details. It also is, of course, at the crossroads of the trade routes. It is the same hub of an industrious Armenian population of tradesmen, and of course it is a place of several population shifts or exchange. And this makes up the history of the Armenians and, of course, more specifically, Kars as well. So when you follow the history of Kars, you see that with each conquest, and of course, some is a narrative, and it doesn't really respond in this full scale. Like, it's not that the Mongols devastated the whole place and that was the major catastrophe. There was a daily life, but still it is a caesura in history. And each time, in each conquest, be it the Seljuks, be it the Mongols, be it later the influx of Kurdish population, be it the Ottomans, there is a certain amount, and of course, Shah Abbas's in early 17th century progressing and depopulating the whole area. So there is a constant removal of settlers, traders, agriculture, and an influx of nomads, nomadic or half-nomadic population, which also changes the economic structure of the region and makes up what we then have in the late 19th century, of course, with the rise of nationalism and the rise of a certain narrative that and a population that is not only divided by different religions, different proto-nations or nations in the coming, but also in a social divide between the plain and the high mountains, and between the settlers and the tradesmen and the merchants in the cities and the countryside, and of course the nomadic population, and also exchanging grain for meat and tools for skins. So, and there is a divide of labor and social class alongside ethnicity or religion. It is a social divide, but it's also accompanied by, let's say, the nomads are the Kurds or the Turks or the Turkomans or the Seljuks, and the settlers and the tradespeople are the Armenians. And of course, so to take this and to sum it up, if you look at the Armenian part of the population, you have this catastrophe and survival. What can you do if you lose, if you have to migrate, if you have to flee, if you have to escape? The only thing that you can take with you is what you have in your brains. At least this is my grandfather's wisdom. So what the Armenians got with them when they migrated and finally came to Transylvania and to other places was their professionalism in certain trades and, of course, merchant contacts. And the more the Armenian community gets dispersed, the more it engages into long distance trade because of you have the Armenian hubs all over the place, so you can engage in global trade networks because you have the Armenian networks. And that somehow functions until today. So why am I talking about Kars? Because Kars, you have these layers of shifting history. You have people, population segments going in and out, this kind of shifts, and each incoming population leaves its marks. And now what you see in Kars, the latest, of course, shift of population is the very tragic mass violence history of the late 19th century and early 20th century, the Hamidian massacres, the genocide of the Armenians, and this removes the entirety of Armenian population and replaces it again with Turkish-speaking population, but a great number of them coming from what is today Azerbaijan and migrating to Kars. In the meanwhile, there is a 40-year episode in the late 19th century which belongs to Imperial Russia. To the Tsarist Empire, we already heard that mentioned, that in the late 19th century, after the Turkish Ottoman Russian War of 1877-78, which ended in a crushing defeat for the Ottomans and in a Russian victory, 3 provinces of the Ottoman Empire were handed to the Russians. One of them was Kars, including Ani, the ruins of Ani. So the city of Kars, city of Ardahan. So, and then in this 40 years, there is again a replacement of population. Now Russian migrants come in. A lot of Armenian migrants pour into the city who fled other cities of Anatolia because of constant instability and massacres. They come to Kars. Once again, there is yet another feature of Armenian history being repeated over and over again. That is that you see the cities in this landscape flourishing when they are somehow centered, and being devastated when they are at the margins of the empire, because then there are the war theater. So whenever there is a little period of peace, and these 40 years of Russian rule are at least a period of peace, the city immediately flourishes. And whenever, of course, there is a war, again, the population is exchanged. And the last, as I said, exchange is after the Armenian genocide, the destruction of the Ottoman Armenians, and then, of course, these Russians are driven out, the Greek population leaves the city, the Armenians, of course, are killed or flee, and there is this influx of Muslim, Turkish, and Tatar, Azeri population. But what is there still in Kars are the traces of all these cultures coming and going. So when you see today the architecture, only the cityscape of Kars, you see the fortress, you see still the Armenian cathedral, Holy Apostle Cathedral, which is still there. The building stands there and at a very prominent place. Whereas there was directly in the vicinity or next to the Armenian cathedral, there was a Russian church structure which was demolished. Other Russian buildings were also, church buildings were demolished, but you see the Russian governmental buildings. You see the city structure at some of in Kars. But you also see the very prominent Ottoman stone bridge of early modern time, and you see in Ottoman what we call the Turkish bath, the hammam. You see them also, the architecture structure in Kars. So what does that, and you see, and this is a somehow fun fact for today's Turkey as a Muslim country, you only in Kars you see the fountains that the Russian built. And these fountains are decorated by nymphs, by sculptures of young females with lofty or no clothing at all. And these fountains with these little figures, they also remained. And the Russian, the palaces, or what in Turkish is called the konak, the villas of the Ottoman government, those were used, and the palaces of the Russian administration and the wealthy Armenian or Russian merchants, they are now used as administrative buildings. They are still there. They are now in the use of the state. So my argument here is, while we see Ani as a ruined but somehow conserved city, we see Kars as a city which has its life until today. It's still a living city. It's the metropolitan center, let's say, of that region, as a palimpsest, with all its layers of the different culture. And because the people are not there anymore, the stone structure reminds us what would be the possibility. Because what is Kars today? It is a border town. As you know, Turkey is blocking Armenia since the downfall of the Soviet Union, so that border is closed, and it does not only harm Armenia, but it also harms the population on the Turkish side, because for them, that border is closed. So this significance that the region has always had as a transitional, as a trade route, as a route of exchange, is closed in front of them. And what happens to peripheral regions? They don't develop, they don't flourish. It is the built stone structure that reminds the population of Kars and reminds the spectator of this, let's say, lost opportunities, lost heritage, lost flourishing, lost wealth today. But also of the loss of opportunity that is created when different people, different cultures, different religions live together and inspire one another in the best of all worlds. Here I come to a short reflection on Transylvania too. I think I jump to here from Eastern Turkey because I think that Transylvania is a similar kind of landscape. A landscape that is shaped by this multitude of people finding refuge here. People coming and living together, finding a way of living together, making that to their own culture. Not always peacefully. I'm not saying, I'm not this kind of person or historian that looks back and say, oh, the past was so splendid. I'm a scholar of mass violence. I know what happened in the past. But there is always the opportunity. And there is a heritage. And there is a heritage that could inspire, and the heritage that inspires even if the greater part of it is lost. And the same you can see that is taking place in Kars today, that there was a local initiative. Unfortunately, there is no longer, but for certain years in the 1990s, and there were local initiatives to restore somehow the Russian heritage, the Armenian heritage, the multitude of heritages for Kars. And there was also local initiatives to open the border, to let Kars flourish again. And also for the ruins of Ani. Turkey, the state of Turkey, is now, if you get, and I get these regularly as a professor of Ottoman studies, I get the information brochures of the Turkish government and the Turkish Ministry of Tourism. And among these materials was a brochure of Ani as a UNESCO heritage site. They are doing excavations in Ani. They were inviting a group of Armenian scholars to show at least that here we are cooperating with the Armenian side. Of course, then there are the shortcomings of that cooperation. But at least there is some effort to rebuild or have a fresh look at the city. Part of it is somehow at the edge of deteriorating or altering or building up a completely new narrative. In Ani, there is not only the Armenian ruins, but there is also a Seljuk mosque. And there is a caravanserai from Seljuk times, from the same medieval times. And of course, it's there because the Seljuk conquest started geographically at that point. And so now what the Turkish, like the director of this institution or the Institute for the Protection of the Ancient Site, so the person who is responsible also for the excavation of Ani, he celebrates in his official account, he celebrates the Seljuk conquest of Ani, and of course he highlights the Seljuk heritage. So Ani is, for the Armenians, is the ancient Armenian capital, but because of this one or two Seljuk buildings, it's also like, it's a cultural appropriation. But then one can reflect on what we can do with it. Of course, if it's not in the Armenian sense that Armenian memory is diminished. Armenians can add to that. But it is a new, somehow, it's something that they try to look at their heritage. If we turn it positively. If we turn it negatively, we can say, okay, this is cultural appropriation and the Armenian part is completely diminished, and this place, which is the Armenian medieval capital, is remembered in Turkey as a Seljuk site. However, the Seljuks came to some place. It is the beginning of at least, even if it's only a handful of people that is involved in this kind, it's the beginning of excavations. It's the beginning of research. Every research has its critical component. So it could be. On the Armenian side, it could be the beginning of critical research of what was Ani and what was the rest of Anatolia in Armenian memory. How and how much Armenians have built on their heritage in Anatolia. Because that's also one side of the story. Did Armenians always cherish their Anatolian heritage? Did Armenians always accept their Anatolian or their, for centuries long, Ottoman heritage? So I forgot to, can you give me one of those books? Because I want to conclude with that. We started, like about 15 years ago, we started a project to look how Armenians look at their Anatolian heritage. Because after the genocide, this is also part of Armenian memory to neglect those centuries that Armenians have lived in the Ottoman Ottoman Empire and have lived together, or not always peacefully, but lived there and were part of that overall Ottoman structure. And when we see Armenian studies, we see that Armenology tends to look at the ancient time up to the Middle Ages. And then, if you look at the Armenian textbook, you see, then there comes, like in 3 sentences, after the fall of Ani began the dark ages of the Turkish yoke, and the Persian yoke, and the Ottoman yoke, and the Seljuk yoke. Everything is a yoke. And then we jump to the late 19th century, when there is the Congress of Berlin, and after that the Armenians are slaughtered. And in between all the centuries is nothing. But that was the everyday life of Armenians and all the Armenian, Western Armenian, which was the bigger part of Armenia, the Ottoman Armenians, and all the modern diaspora, not necessarily the Transylvanian, but here, maybe also, or in Hungary, there is a layer of new influx of Armenians from the Republic of Armenia, and then these people bring with them a new layer of Armenian history and Armenian memory that is the being survivor of the genocide, but also being in part Turkish-speaking, having lived under Ottoman rule, sharing that Ottoman world. And with this project, whose director is Vahet Ashtian, who will speak to you later, we try to somehow reconstruct and re-establish the everyday life of Ottoman Armenians, which is also, you can see as a heritage, or let's say the ruins of Ani, or the layers, the palimpsest layers of memory of Kars, invite us to do so, to accept and return to that layer of Armenian life. Thank you.
You have here remote.
This one, right? Oh, it works. Perfect. So, good afternoon, everyone. I hope that you can hear me well. First of all, I would like to say that it's a great pleasure to be here and participate in this amazing event. Thank you very much to the organizers of it. I would normally say great job, but I think that you are actually doing something more than a great job. It's really rare thing during such events to experience such a level not only of professionalism but also of hospitality and dedication. So thank you very much for that. On a kind of personal note, it's also for me a very kind of important and touching moment to be here and be able to present at this venue, because some 10 years ago, when I was still starting my kind of PhD journey, I was here in Cluj and in some other Transylvanian towns for my fieldwork, for my research on local Armenian heritage and its current life. It's amazing to see even among the audience some people who were hosting me here, who were helping me here. So I feel really honored to be able now to come in a slightly new role and share some results of the research on which I am working now. I guess that I should also maybe say a few words about a project to which all of us are somehow connected, which is titled Lost But Found, and the project is about Ani as this kind of, city that does not exist as a city anymore, as you could hear, but which is still a huge, central, very important symbol in Armenian culture, and it has this very important social life even nowadays. So we are all in some ways connected to this project. Me and Karen, who will present later, we are researchers, postdoc researchers in this project. Professor Hartman and Balint Kovac, who will present also later, are heads of these projects. And I could say perhaps that Professor Kawi and Professor Tascian are kinds of, guardian angels for this project, and they are also helping us a lot and supporting us and contributing to the results of our project. So it's really great to have all of you here, and I think this will also allow you to understand better like who we are and what is the kind of design behind this small conference in which we are participating today. So after these few words of introduction, and now let me come to my topic, and it would be something much more narrow compared to these, grand tours offered by Professor Kawi and Professor Hartman, something much more modest in its scope and scale, and also a kind of, preliminary results of the research which I am doing now as a person who was the latest one to join this project. My background is in cultural anthropology, so what I do is not so much related to the history, but to the present situation, to the contemporary situation, and I am kind of focusing on Ani now. One of my focuses is Ani as a sort of Armenian pilgrimage site. Yeah? So I'm going to discuss Ani as a contemporary destination for what I would call through this presentation as Armenian roots pilgrimage to Yerkir, and Yerkir is the Armenian word that means a land, but it also has this more specific meaning of a lost homeland of ancestors, of Armenian ancestors in today's eastern and central Turkey. And I will focus on the historical, geographical, environmental, and architectural features of Ani that make it both one of the most important sites on roots pilgrims' routes to the lost homeland, but also that make this place to stand out among other shrines to the lost homeland. So those of you who participate, who present in this conference, they know quite well the meaning of this quote in Armenian language, Der mikarot unem ankach, anites nem unormer nem. For those of you who don't know it, we can translate it roughly as, I still have one unfulfilled yearning to see Ani before I die. And these are words, these are opening lines of an iconic poem titled, unsurprisingly, Ani, by Armenian author Hovhannes Shiras, who in these few words captured, I think, in the most succinct and powerful way, the feeling that many Armenians have towards the ruined capital of their medieval kingdom. Shiras, who was born in 1914 and spent almost entire life in the Soviet Union, I think he never had a chance to go to Ani and could at best gaze at the ruins of it only from a distance, separated from it by the deep gorge that you can see here on this picture of the Ahurian River, and also by the close Turkish-Soviet border. However, another leading 20th century Armenian artist, Martyros Saryan, was a painter. He had a very long life, so he managed to visit Ani when it was still accessible. He went there in 1903, and this experience had such a profound impact on him that more than 60 years later, he did not only write that every Armenian has Ani in his heart, but he was also bold and brave enough to pen a letter addressed directly to Leonid Brezhnev, at that time the leader of the Soviet Union. And this letter echoes this Shiraz sentiment, the sentiment from this opening quote, but at the same time express even a bolder wish not only to see Ani, but to make it Armenian again. And I will quote from this letter now, and here you can see it for your convenience. So, I will be 88 years old in a few days, and before I leave this world, I want to step onto the land where my ancestors came from. These are the ruins of the medieval capital of Armenia, the city of Ani. This is an architectural monument of world significance, the pride and heritage of my people. The 5 square kilometers that the ruins of the city of Ani occupy is a small territory. But this small piece of land is a sacred place of Armenia. I ask you on behalf of the entire Armenian nation, on behalf of all cultural people, to return Ani to the bosom of the motherland. So obviously, Saryan's dream has never come true, but starting from early 1990s, the ruins of Ani began increasingly more open to public, being gradually transformed from a closed military zone to a touristic destination and a UNESCO World Heritage Site. As a part of this transformation, Ani became also one of the most important destinations for Armenian roots pilgrims. And now let me briefly explain what I understand under this maybe slightly obscure term of roots pilgrimage. So I am taking it from the work by David Gitlitz and Linda Davidson, who worked on visits that Jewish people would pay to sites of Holocaust in Poland and in other places, and they were the first to develop this concept, and they define it as such. The principal goal of roots pilgrims is not renewed faith or access to the divine, but an intensified sense of self, of connectedness to past personal history. Roots pilgrims search for this connectedness and sense of self in places of recollection, not portals to the miraculous. The sacralization of these sites is part and parcel of the creation of a secular religion of memory. So, most of places of recollection visited by Armenian roots pilgrims are former Armenian villages and towns, schools and churches, or water springs, or walnut orchards, or whatever was a part of what we could call an Armenian everyday landscape that was then desolated and destroyed during the genocide. However, the ruins of Ani stand out among these places of recollection for at least 3 reasons. One of them is Ani's long history as a ruined and almost uninhabited city that fed Armenian imagination as a symbol of past Armenian greatness already before the Armenian genocide. Another aspect is the city's location on the closed Armenian-Turkish border. Yet another is the imaginative and evocative power of Ani's landscape, blending to an quite extraordinary and haunting effect the natural and man-made elements. In the rest of this presentation, I will briefly address these 3 outstanding characteristics of Ani. So first, Ani became for Armenians an extraordinary landscape much before the genocide, described with awe by Armenian and foreign authors alike, proudly claimed as the place of origin by different Armenian communities, as we could hear, including Armenians in Transylvania, and at least since extraordinary in their own terms, excavations of Nikolai Mar and his team at the turn of the 20th century, these ruins were also visited by hundreds of Armenians from near and afar, who, like Saryan, whom I quoted, wanted, and I quote from him again, wanted to walk around in silence and contemplate Ani's past glory. After several decades of hiatus, from the second until the last decade of the 20th century, when the ruined city was first a war zone and then became a part of an inaccessible military zone on Turkish-Soviet border, Armenian roots pilgrims started visiting Ani, as I said, from the early 1990s. But in contrast to most other shrines of roots pilgrimage, it became one of the must-see places, regardless of the fact that actually none of the pilgrims had their family roots in the city. Furthermore, for those of today's Armenian visitors to Ani who are aware of this late 19th, early 20th century new role of Ani as a major archaeological site in the Russian Empire, the place where we can say that Armenian archaeology was born, also the place where one of the first modern Armenian museums was created, and where many Armenian artists, community leaders, and champions of Armenian national movement would come for inspiration. The ruined city is a place that was lost not once, but twice. This feeling of a double loss could be further strengthened when the visitors, the pilgrims, also know about the fate of most part of the priceless items discovered during these excavations, which were lost, unfortunately, amidst the turmoil of the First World War. Besides the historical role of Ani as a lost city, which, and I quote now from Razmik Panusian, which stands as one of the most visible and tangible symbols of past Armenian greatness, and hence a source of pride, the special status of Ani for Armenians in general, and Armenian root pilgrims in particular, stems from its location directly on the close Armenian-Turkish border. When diaspora Armenians with family roots in the former Ottoman Empire reach Ani and gaze towards the Republic of Armenia on the other side of the Hungarian River, they can have quite conflicting feelings both towards the lost homeland of their ancestors and towards the country which is their official homeland. The following scene, and now you can also read it, and I will read it for you, which was witnessed by Karel Bertram, an author of an important recent book, A House in the Homeland, Armenian Pilgrimages to Places of Ancestral Memory, I think captures quite well this ambiguity. So I quote, "In Ani, as group of pilgrims looked across the Hungarian River that separates the Republic of Turkey from the Republic of Armenia, Sebuch sighed. Ah, the homeland. But not everyone agreed. That's not my homeland, said Paul, who had just visited his grandfather's town of Harpert. This is my homeland. This heartfelt rejoinder came in spite of the fact that Paul's great-grandfather was taken to the town square where, before killing him, his captors had pulled his hair out one by one. Later, Paul's wife, Priscilla, gave her resigned opinion. This was our homeland, but our homeland turned on us." The presence of the border and the view on a vast plateau on its Armenian side, slowly rising towards the massif of Mount Aragats, has a strong effect also on Armenians coming to Ani from Armenia. When I visited the ruined city with a group of such roots pilgrims, I could observe how they were visibly moved by this reverse perspective that allowed them to see their homeland from the outside, while trying to understand where exactly the borderline was and identify Armenian settlements and other familiar spots on the other side of the river. Furthermore, the location of the ruined city on the border often triggers images of how it would be if one could actually cross the Hungarian River and go to Ani directly from Armenia. Such images are additionally fed by a recurring idea to rebuild a famous bridge in Ani. The idea, which is voiced especially during periods of Tau in otherwise tense diplomatic relations between Armenia and Turkey. This way, we could say that the ruins of Ani in general and the bridge in particular serve as a sort of thermometer indicating the temperature of Armenian-Turkish diplomatic relations. And finally, as some fragments of the above discussion already suggest, not only history of Ani and its current location on political map contribute to its unique character. Equally important is the ruined city ambience, created both by the power of nature and the power of man. scattered ruined, still witnessing to the former glory of the city. Vast steppes and mountains surrounding the city, with only a few small settlements visible around. A present emptiness of the place. The crunch of stones that once were part of the bustling city's infrastructure under one's feet. The sound and chill of wind, often blowing in the plateau and turning the grass overgrowing the ruins into a waving sea. With these and other qualities and characteristics, Ani emerges not as a passive space, but rather as an active and powerful agent with trajectories, propensities, and tendencies of its own. More precisely, it encourages, almost forces, the Armenian visitors to consider and contemplate its former greatness and glory. Like Adam's Peak, a famous pilgrimage site in Sri Lanka, studied by Alexander McKinley, and now I paraphrase him, Ani helps make its own myth, with humans sometimes seeming to be mere mouthpieces for tales the ruined city is already telling. This power and agency of Ani requires, of course, a much more careful examination that I can offer here. But instead, I will conclude now with a few accounts from Ani, penned by Armenian roots pilgrims. As I walked amidst the ruins of this ancient capital of Armenia, the howling sound of the wind brought to my mind pictures of the glories of an Armenia that was. That afternoon, I was sitting in the window of one of the ruins overlooking the vast area below. Never have I seen a sight more beautiful. In front and above us were the mountains of Armenia. Below flowed the peaceful Hungarian river, which separates Ani from the rest of Armenia. It was a place I did not want to leave. The words of a song my father used to sing came back to me. I am the city of Ani, sitting and weeping. There is no one to say, do not weep. They say, no, let her sit and weep. Oh, when will I hear, do not weep, do not weep. The words of a poet struck the deepest of my soul as I remembered our glorious past. And finally, a poem composed by one of the pilgrims herself, and here I would like to express my gratitude to Karen Jalatian for translating it for me for the sake of this presentation. We reached the aging Ani. The wind fluttered unrestrained. It fissured my bones, cut the strings of my heart, shook my helpless body. I have seen many winds, but have not encountered one such. Wounded Ani was in anguish. Downtrodden Ani was pleading. Forgotten Ani was protesting. Ruined Ani was cursing. We abandoned Ani distressed, shameful, grieving, helpless. The arrow pierced into my heart, draining my body and soul. Oh, that Ani, oh, that wind. So as these quotations show, Ani exerts its power over people who visit it as roots pilgrims not only through sight, but also sound and touch. And to retain, at least to a little extent, this multisensorial experience, let me finish my talk and invite you now for something not only for your ears, but only for your eyes. And I will take you now to a short photographic journey to the landmarks of Ani through the pictures which I took when I joined one of these groups of roots pilgrims to Ani and other parts of here. So, but these are famous walls and the main gate of Ani. So this would be the site that Armenians and other visitors see when they approach the city and we enter it. These are the walls from the other side, seeing from the inside. And then you can see it's only part of their length, but you can already imagine how huge the site is. This would be the church of Tigran Honenz, famous from the best preserved frescoes among all the churches of Ani, and of course it's also one of the kind of key points that the visitors would see there. Here are some of the frescoes inside the church. Here is a view on Hungarian river. And here is a view on most important landmarks of the city, which includes the mosque that was mentioned by Professor Hartmann, and the main cathedral of Ani, and the church of Surp Amena Perkic. And this is the view on the so-called hexagonal church, which is a part of the citadel or a fortress of Ani, one of the oldest part of the city. And here you can see the fortress from another angle, and the church dedicated to Saint Gregory the Illuminator. And another church of Saint Gregory, but more often known as Gagigashen, because of the king Gagik who founded it. And finally, the famous also the cave city of Ani, because Ani was not only these churches, not only the structures, not only 1,001 churches as we could hear, but also thousands and thousands of caves that were actually a large part of the city. So Ani has this surface part, but it also has the underground part, which is almost equally fascinating as the well-known monuments. And here you can see the list of the places that you could see. So thank you very much for your attention, and now we will have a break, I guess. Or